Chapter 2. About a month prior to Elion making his surprise welcome to the family, on June 21 of 2044, Lovisa had found out that she too was pregnant. "At least Lovisa is having a full 9 months warning," Bobby John said as he made himself comfortable on the upstairs couch. Nicole and Karina had come over for a visit to see the baby and also to spread the news to Tommy that Deputy Mark Ketz, formerly of the Moffat County Sheriff's Department, was to start with the Craig Police Department the following day. "So?" Tom answered with an odd look on his face, "We always have new officers and deputies coming and going." As he spoke, Tom had carefully picked Elion up out of his father's arms so that Bobby John could get up. "Not like Mark Ketz." Nicole spoke as she lightly patted Elion on the back as the 4-month-old seemed to be searching the room with his eyes. "Mark Ketz gets an attitude towards people very quickly and without reason. You'll really need to watch your back with him on the department." After David disappeared, Karina spoke up. "Mark Ketz was real quick to point the finger at our own family." As Karina said this, Tommy's mind had gone back to about 2 years after he had started with the police department, when he had shown up at the Ridgeview Apartments, in uniform to help with the search for David. He remembered a heated argument that spurred between a newer deputy and Nicole. "Yeah. Now I remember," Tom said as he turned to look at Karina. "He had said something out of line to you at the apartments." Nicole ended up chewing his ass out while Chief Kibbe backed her up. "And brought her back from retirement, in front of Mark Ketz," Karina added. Then watched as Bobby John grabbed a bottle of formula out of the refrigerator. 0 hours Bobby. Let me feed Elion for ya. It's been many years since I've helped feed an infant." Simultaneously Tommy then handed Elion to his great-grandmother. "Well, just wait 4 months, Macaulay said as he walked into the living room. "We're about to have one too and you can change all of the diapers." "Well hi Macaulay," Karina said as she wrapped her free arm around her grandson. "I was hoping that you'll just come get the kids for the diaper change and then return them to me right afterwards." "Can I hold Elion?" Angel asked as he came out to the kitchen. Angel had woken to the sound of Karina's and Nicole's voices talking about a new officer to the police department. Now, as he walked into the well-lit kitchen, as Bobby John now helped his wife prepare breakfast, he lightly wrapped his arms around his great-aunt's waist as he hoped to hold the newest member to the family. "Well hello Angel. How are you doing this evening?" Karina asked as she slightly knelt down to his standing height. "I'm doing good," the 34-year-old responded. Then, as Angel continued his hug, he now simultaneously patted Elion on the upper back, between the shoulder blades. "Well of course you can hold him," Karina said as she carefully brought the infant down off of her shoulder. "Just be gentle hun." She finished and then assisted Angel in placing the baby over his shoulder. Almost exactly 2 months later, on Bobby John's 20th birthday, the routine family day took place at Malachi's and Nicole's apartment. "Let's play Monopoly," Malachi suggested as he looked into their hall closet that contained board games. "And watch some DVDs," Eddie added. "Sounds like a plan considering the weather outside," Nicole said as she opened the apartment door as someone knocked. Looking back at her was Ronnie as he held onto 2 buckets of ice cream, one in each hand, and then a plastic grocery bag clenched between his teeth. "Well Ronnie. You know that we could have helped you out if you needed it." As Nicole spoke, before she had a chance to close the door, a thin layer of snow had covered the carpet immediately in front of the apartment door. "Yeah, I know," Ron answered after removing the bag from his teeth. "I just thought that it would be nice to allow everyone else to stay warm." Then, after Ronnie removed his coat, a dark green down parka, he looked up to find his brother staring back at him. "Hey. What's up?" "Well," Malachi said as he smiled back at his little brother, "the sacrifice is with good intentions. However, we've gotta go to Safeway to find a few DVDs." Waiting for a response, Malachi watched both Angel and Eddie put the jugs of ice cream into the kitchen freezer. "What's this?" Lovisa asked as she held open the bag that her father-in-law had just carried in. Looking inside the bag she had then, before Ron could even answer her, seen about a half-dozen DVDs. "I had already thought ahead on the idea of DVDs," Ron said as he looked at his brother. "The weather is too nasty to do anything else. With his response, Ron then stuck his tongue out at his brother. "You two crack me up," Lovisa said as she then removed the DVDs from the plastic bag. "You guys. I swear, you guys are always on good terms, always joking together, always playing. Are you guys sure that you're brothers?" Lovisa asked as a smile stretched ear to ear. As Lovisa spoke, she had to hold on to her belly as the 7th month of her pregnancy was quickly turning into the 8th. After Angel, Lovisa was the next shortest person in the family. Or at least of the adults. So, due to her own small stature, she looked as though she had been carrying this child for over a year now. "Those are my boys." Karina spoke up as she quickly reached out and jabbed her fingertips into Angel's sides. In response, Angel nearly jumped into Eddie's arms as he sat on the couch facing Angel. Along with his jump he also shrieked loudly, causing Elian to jump within his mother's arms, always in a good mood with one another. "That was perfect for those rainy days," Karina added. "Well, I can see where they got it from," Dondi said as she was finding herself attempting to restrain her son. It was about 7:30 in the evening of March 21st, exactly on Mika's due date, that Lovisa had woken up to what she felt could have been contractions. The pain wasn't extreme, however it was enough that she knew that it was time. Being that it wasn't, at the moment, an emergency, she decided that she would alert her sleeping husband in a very mildly jokingly way. Turning her head to face him, she saw Macaulay sleeping on his side, facing her, as a little dribble of drool ran off of his canine tooth soaking a small spot on the pillow. As Lovisa also laid on her side, facing Macaulay, she reached out, with her left index finger, and carefully swiped the minute little drool off of the tooth. Nearing the tip of the sharp tooth, she suddenly pulled her arm back as she felt an instant sting to the tip of her finger. Immediately Lovisa felt a little stream of blood running down the side of her index finger as she quickly put the finger into her mouth. Well, Lovisa thought to herself, that was the wrong idea. About 5 minutes later, as she could no longer taste blood coming from her finger, she had decided to work on another mild way of waking her husband away from his teeth. Reaching out towards his trail, under his belly button, Lovisa felt the thick coarse hairs and then carefully took a hold of a single hair between her thumb and the same index finger that she had just injured. Carefully, after she knew that it was just a single hair, she pulled it quickly completely out of his belly, causing Macaulay to slightly jump and swipe at himself with his right hand. Without him waking up to the assault, Lovisa did it again, causing him, this time, to turn over onto his belly, hiding his trail that led into his boxers. After Macaulay hadn't woken up to the hair pulling on his belly, Lovisa then moved on to his armpit hairs, of which immediately woke him up. At first, Macaulay didn't really move. In fact, he had began to stare at his wife from under his arm until he realized that she was staring back at him. With this discovery, Macaulay then lifted his head with a sort of odd look on his face. "What's going on?" he asked. "Not much," Lovisa whispered back, "it's that time though." Listening to her response, Macaulay then laid his head back onto his pillow as he processed her words. Looking at Macaulay's face after he laid back down, Lovisa was able to see the exact moment that he had realized what it was that she had whispered to him. This response began with Macaulay suddenly opening his eyes so wide that it had appeared that his eyeballs might just pop out of his head. This took place without him even moving his head from his pillow. The secondary response was him suddenly lifting himself up to his elbow as he then stared back at her. "Did you say that it's that time?" Macaulay asked. He had been personally expecting this moment to come at the worst timing possible, such as when he was away from his wife's side, or out to Ridgeview in the bad weather. The last thing that he had expected is that they would actually be all ready to go. "Yep. I said it, honey," Lovisa said as another possible contraction caused her to reach around her belly again for support. Being that this was obviously Lovisa's first time, she wasn't 100% sure if this was the real thing. She did know that this was in fact the due date and that, whatever it was that she was feeling, was slowly increasing in pain and a shorter period of time between contractions. As they had pre-planned and rehearsed, Macaulay immediately notified Bobby John, Eddie, Angel, Tommy, and Lucifer by ESP while Lovisa called over to Ronnie's and Belinda's apartment, and then she called and spoke to her father. Then, as planned, Bobby John used his cell phone to call the hospital. "The Memorial Hospital. How may I help you?" Ah yes. My sister-in-law is pregnant and is due today. She is now in labor, so we're headed over to the hospital. All right, sir. What's your sister-in-law's name? Lovisa Declue, ma'am, Bobby John said as he then also entered Macaulay's and Lovisa's room to grab the diaper bag. Being that everyone was well aware of the pregnancy, as opposed to when Elian was born, everyone planned to attend to today's delivery. All right, sir. We'll see you in just a couple of minutes. I will be ready for you. The nurse said just as everyone was ready to load up in both Bobby John's and Don D's truck, and Macaulay's and Lovisa's car. It was 8:45 when everyone walked into the hospital. And, just as planned, staff were waiting on their arrival. Then, as if it was also rehearsed, Eddie gathered all of the coats together and put them all into the closet of the room that would be Lovisa's after the baby was born. It's gonna be all right, honey, Macaulay said as he held Lovisa's hand on the way to the delivery room. As a male nurse pushed the wheelchair from the hospital entrance, Macaulay walked beside the chair to comfort his wife. I'm gonna be right beside you all the way through this. Lovisa was now really hurting as they approached the delivery room. She understood what her husband was saying to her but was almost too out of breath to give him a proper verbal response. Instead, she lightly tightened up her grip onto his hand just as they reached the delivery room. Mr. Declue. The male nurse spoke up. If you would you please lower the side rail of the gurney? Sure. Macaulay answered. I've just got to step on this pedal. Right? With his question, Macaulay then also pointed at a rubber-covered pedal near the floor. No. Actually, you've got to push that chrome-colored button beside the rail. The nurse said as he pointed near the head of the steel frame. Moments later, at about 8:55, there was 2 different nurses and the doctor in the room preparing to receive the baby. Unlike his brother-in-law, and most of the males in their family for that matter, Macaulay chose to just hold his wife's hand rather than cutting the umbilical cord. This was for 2 reasons. One is that he would prefer to comfort his wife, and then the second reason, based off of stories, by his father, his uncle Malachi, and Bobby John, he decided that most likely, he wouldn't have the stomach for it. All right, Lovisa. Dr. Kennedy's voice came from the foot of the gurney. Just like Don D's delivery, this one is gonna be a quick one too. Now, when I say to, I'm gonna want you to push as hard as you can. Now if I say to stop pushing, I want you to instantly relax. Understand? Hum. Lovisa managed through her pain. Lovisa had tried to concentrate her attention on her husband so that maybe the pain would be easier to deal with. Through her efforts, however, all that she managed to do is pop his knuckles and cause the tips of his fingers to turn purple. Throughout the previous 9 months, also unlike Bobby John and Don D, Lovisa and Macaulay have had ultrasounds done so that they would be prepared for the child ahead of time. During those 9 months, they discovered that the baby was a boy, and then that turned into picking names for the child. Through the many names that they had filtered through, they finally came up with the name Mika Husta, Clue. With Macaulay's free hand, he dabbed beads of sweat off of Lovisa's forehead that had began to make streams down into her face. It would seem that each contraction would start another stream that would attempt to assault her eyes. It's all right, honey, Macaulay said as he knelt over Lovisa and hit her on the forehead. I'm here for you. In response, Lovisa could only stare at her husband and try to muster a smile in hopes that he understood. All right, Lovisa. The doctor spoke up. Push one more time. Then, as instructed, Lovisa pushed as hard as she could, causing veins to stick out of the side of her neck. Moments later, as Lovisa put every ounce of effort into it, all of the hard work and the last 9 months came to an end with the loud screaming of a newborn that was quickly whisked away and then brought back seconds later wrapped up in a white towel. Immediately the baby was placed onto Lovisa's chest, where both Lovisa and Macaulay just stared in awe. Halfway kneeling and halfway laying on the gurney, beside his wife, Macaulay lightly reached out and touched the side of Mika's fist. Hello, Mika. I'm your father, Macaulay whispered, and then looked at his wife's face to see her smiling with deep joy in her appearance. Hey Macaulay, Lovisa whispered into Macaulay's ear. Go get your parents and my father. Okay. Okay, honey, Macaulay said as he immediately stood up. I'll be right back. As opposed to when Elian was born, Macaulay and Lovisa both worried about the vitals and general health of Micah from the moment that the aggressively active child made its first cry. Macaulay, himself, should have been expecting it, yet some way of which he didn't even understand. He didn't expect how big the actual differences were. Even though his own vitals were identical, and once again he knew it, he was shocked to hear that Micah's temperature was only 73.1 while his heart rate was 180 and then Micah's respirations were 40. Macaulay. You should know this, Ronnie said just after the doctor left the examination room. You, your wife, your mom and I. You know that we're all vampires, Macaulay. These vitals are normal for us. And if you push the issue with Dr. Kennedy, that man will needlessly find himself down a dead-end road. Don't let him investigate this issue any further. Well, Dad. What do I tell him now when he returns? I didn't know that these vitals would lead to problems if looked into, Macaulay said as he placed his index finger into his son's fist. Lovisa was asleep from the time that Micah was born. Since the sky was filled with snow clouds, it was decided that it would be okay for them to stay at the hospital a little longer. After Lovisa dozed off, Dr. Kennedy began to speak to Macaulay about the differences with the baby's vitals. You've got to tell him whatever it takes, Macaulay, Ronnie said now in a very serious tone of voice. Dr. Kennedy is a good doctor, but that won't stop me from putting an end to the man if I feel that this would create a problem for our safety. A problem for our safety? Dad, what are you saying? Turning his back towards his father, Macaulay began to rub his temples as he felt a sudden headache coming on. Macaulay, Ron said as he put a hand on his son's shoulder, I know that we've had this talk before. Speaking now in a quiet voice, Ron continued, remember back to when you first began to fly. We all went to Texas and your grandma Marie had a long conversation with you and Lovisa both about the importance of the silence into who and what we are. Macaulay. We are vampires. Living breathing creatures of the night. We are nocturnal so that our existence is kept quiet. For the most part, we keep to ourselves so that our existence is kept quiet. Almost whispering now, do not allow that doctor, nor any other doctor to ever research anything into our health. Your uncle Malachi, Eddie, and I once destroyed a doctor because of hasty actions into trying to put his nose into our business. We will do it again. Okay, Dad, Macaulay said as he turned himself within his father's grip, I'll just tell Dr. Kennedy that those vitals are normal for our family. And that I do not want him to research this issue beyond this very room. Pausing as he placed his own hand on his father's shoulder, it's gonna be alright, Dad. Relax. Then, just as Macaulay finished his sentence, the doctor walked back into the room. Alright, Mr. DeClue. Dr. Kennedy started, all that I need you to do is fill out and sign. Actually, doctor, after having a talk with my father just now, I now know that Micah's vitals are normal for our family. You can check my vitals, if you would like. Or even my father's vitals. As Macaulay continued to speak, his father nodded his head as to confirm what he was saying. So, with this brought to light, I would prefer if you didn't research this at all, Dr. Kennedy. In fact, I don't want anything involving our health to leave this room at all. Are you sure about this? Dr. Kennedy asked quietly. Yes. Ronnie spoke up for his son, we are very sure. We haven't only gone through this throughout my life, but also for many generations before me. Any time that someone looks into it, it only causes problems. What we have is not transferable or contagious, it's not something that affects anyone outside of our immediate family. Therefore, it's best left alone. But nothing, Dr. Kennedy. Ronnie suddenly said in a very serious tone of voice. We will not change our minds on this. Your grandson, Elion, is the same way. The doctor said as an attempt to change the subject. Therefore, you're right. It is hereditary. So, do what we ask of you then, Macaulay said quietly, keep this just to us. We don't want anyone to ever look into our personal health. Exactly a week after Micah found his way into the world, both Macaulay and Lovisa found themselves headed back to the hospital with their son. Normally, with the DeClue family anyhow, the newborns, with their mothers, are kept in the hospital for about 2 days due to the difference within the infant's health. With Micah's situation, however, being that both Macaulay and his father jumped all over Dr. Kennedy about possible research, Micah's dental along with his general medical was completely overlooked. Ah yeah. Can I help you? The secretary asked as Lovisa and Macaulay approached the desk. Yes. Macaulay answered, we've got an appointment with Dr. Lynch today and then Dr. Kennedy afterwards. All right. The lady responded as she then handed a clipboard to Macaulay. Go ahead and fill this out. This is for Micah DeClue. Right? Yes ma'am. When we call you in, just bring it with you, okay sir? The women said then watched as Macaulay and Lovisa both walked away. It was nearly an hour before the secretary had called Micah's name. It had seemed as though that everyone in the city of Craig had been called into the office before Micah. About time. Macaulay commented as him and his wife both stood up. Then, as they went through the door, that the secretary held open for them, they found Dr. Lynch waiting in the hallway for them. Sorry for making you guys wait so long. The doctor said as he led them to an examination room, I planned on spending more time with you guys than what I normally would with someone else. Why's that? Macaulay asked as he allowed his wife and the doctor to walk into the small room first. Because Mr. DeClue, when at any other time that a child is born into your family, I'm normally called in at the time of birth. Closing the door behind Macaulay, Dr. Lynch then sat down on a stool where he already had a new file folder laid out with Micah's name and date of birth labeled on it. Now, a week after Micah is born, I'm finally seeing him. Why is that, Mr. DeClue? Because my father and I got into an argument with Dr. Kennedy shortly after Micah was born, and so we... Over what? Dr. Lynch interrupted. Because Dr. Kennedy wanted to research Micah's health due to the difference in the vitals. And our family is very strict on the fact that we don't allow this research to take place. As Macaulay spoke, he patted lightly on Micah's back as he laid over Lovisa's shoulder. Well. Let's lay Micah on the counter right here, guys. The doctor said as he stood up and laid a thick blanket on the counter. After watching Lovisa lay her son down, the doctor then carefully opened Micah's mouth, with both index fingers, and then began to examine Micah's upper gum line. Just as Dr. Lynch knew was normal for the DeClue family, he found, very quickly, that the upper two canine teeth were partially pre-developed. With this finding, he had also found two portholes, in the roof of Micah's mouth, that seemed to nurse off of every drop of saliva that came into contact with the top plate. These two portholes were located directly behind the pre-developed canines. Then, as the doctor looked back towards the depths of Micah's mouth, without choking the infant, he could then also see the saliva being redrawn from the nasal passages. Well, by what I see here, everything is normal. For someone in your family, that is. Then, as the doctor kept a protective hand on Micah's chest, he then looked back to Macaulay. You know, you shouldn't take it so personally when a doctor shows interest in the background of your family's health. More often than what you may believe, Macaulay, a doctor often cares about his patients. Sometimes this care means finding out why the patient's vitals are so far off from others. Sometimes this care means finding out why there are holes in the roof of their patient's mouth. Or why the canines are partially pre-developed prior to birth. Macaulay. Dr. Lynch continued as he personally picked up the infant and placed him over his own shoulder. As doctors, we do care. But, Dr. Lynch. Macaulay interrupted. Macaulay. The doctor counter-interrupted, I know. It is hereditary. This is normal for your family. And, I know that you're not gonna change your mind on the research. And, I'm not asking you to. All that I'm asking. The doctor continued as he now reached out and lightly set a hand on Micah's father's shoulder, is that when a doctor does ask you about research, that you don't take it as a personal attack. Most doctors only want the best for their patients. Sometimes that often means asking questions. And, you're right, Dr. Lynch. We just want to make sure that those questions don't leave that room. With the end of his sentence, Macaulay then watched as the doctor handed Micah to Lovisa. No. The doctor went on. What happens here stays here. I want it to be okay, however, with you that once in a while, I may need to pull your medical chart, your dad's, your... I can't speak for my dad or anyone else. Macaulay interrupted, you can compare my medical records, if you would like to, but you would have to ask others about theirs. As Macaulay spoke, he watched as the doctor began to manipulate Micah's mouth and cheek, while Lovisa held on to him. It appeared, to Macaulay, that Dr. Lynch was just continuing his examination. "Is everything all right?" "Well, yeah," the doctor answered, "just curious if the canine's roots are grown up into the zygoma bone tissues at all. The reason that I'm wondering about this is because of the fact that the portholes in the roof of the mouth go all the way into the nasal passages and then into the esophagus. I'm just curious what all these differences affect." Macaulay obviously knew, by the fact that he wasn't the doctor, that Dr. Lynch would know about those differences better than himself. As far as medically speaking anyhow. "So, are we okay to go then?" "Yes. You guys are doing all right. Just let me know if you run into any complications at all," the older man said, and then reached out to shake Macaulay's hand. "Thank you, doctor." "Just call me Mike," Dr. Lynch interrupted. "And here's an appointment card," he said, and then handed what looked like a business card to Macaulay as they began to follow Lovisa out of the office. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning when Tina was walking out of the hospital. She was working her normal shift, but then decided to call it quits early for the day, when she found out that she was pregnant for her first child. Tina wasn't only excited, she was nearly jumping with joy when she had accidentally ran into a man beside the exit door of the hospital. "Oh. I'm sorry, sir," Tina said, and then realized that she was looking at her Hispanic neighbor from across the street. "Well, hello neighbor." "Hello, how are you doing?" Macaulay asked as he looked back at the lady. "I'm doing all right," Tina responded as she looked at the baby that laid asleep over her neighbor's shoulder. "Just found out about 20 minutes ago that I'll have my first child 9 months from now." "Well, congratulations," Macaulay said as he then turned himself to where his neighbor could see Micah's face. "Ours is now exactly 1 week old." As Macaulay spoke, he had a smile on his face that almost seemed to glow. "We're gonna have a lot of children living on our street," Tina said, and then patted Micah on the back. "Oh, and by the way, my name is Tina and my husband's name is William." "Well, hello Tina," Macaulay said as he reached out, with his free hand, to shake the lady's hand, "and yeah. We've got 2 babies in our home now. I'm sure that this is just the beginning of a baby boom. Don't you have a young boy living with you too? About 10 years old or so?" "Oh. You're talking about Angel. Angel appears to be very young and has the energy of a 10-year-old as well. The fact is, however, is that Angel is 36 years old now." "36? Tina said just a little louder than Macaulay's volume. "How could he be?" "It's a long story," Macaulay said. "Our entire family tends to look a lot younger than reality." "I wonder if that's due to your Hispanic background?" Tina questioned as she continued to pat Micah on the back. "Don't know," Macaulay lied. "It could have part to do with it though." Then, as Macaulay paused, him and Tina watched as Lovisa pulled up to the door with the car. "Well, it's been nice to talk to you, Tina. You're welcome to stop over and visit anytime." And vice versa, Tina said as she too began to walk out the door. "You guys can stop over at any time." Just under 9 months later, December 7th of 2044, Bill and Tina had finally come up with a name for their soon-to-be son. At first, however, they had tossed back and forth the idea of naming the child William as to make what would turn out to be William LLL. It wasn't until this moment, however, that they decided that they would hold that particular name off until they came up with another boy. "Michael Dale Hall," Bill said as he looked to his beautiful wife. "That sounds perfect." Over the 9 months of pregnancy, Tina had grown a lot, yet had also kept positive about herself, knowing that she would go back to her small figure fairly quickly. In a thin stature, with average health, Tina knew that her child would turn out okay. Bill's health was also good. Within his family background there was a tendency for cancer, yet, as to this point, seemed to have jumped over him altogether. One thing that both Bill and Tina both shared together, however, was the tendency to have a few too many drinks here and there. For Tina, however, she knew when to stop, and that meant keeping a job and having a healthy child. With Bill's job, with API Insulation, most of the guys that he worked with were also the guys that he most often drank with as well. A cool, level-headed group of people, that worked as a team to complete a job as quickly and safely as possible. "I agree," Tina said as she stood up and kissed her husband. "Michael Dale Hall does sound perfect." Then, as she wrapped her arms around Bill, she had lightly felt a false contraction going through her belly as she rested up against Bill's body. With the closeness, Bill too could feel the tightening within her. "Are you all right, honey?" Bill asked. With his question, he then pulled away from her as he simultaneously placed his hand on her stomach. Bill was determined, just as much as his wife was, that his children would turn out perfect. And if any sign were to show otherwise, they would both be on top of it. "Yeah. I'm fine," Tina said as she pulled herself close to her husband again. "As long as I'm here in your arms, I'll always be all right." In the late evening of the 27th, what Tina had once called false labor, had quickly turned into the real thing just as she was about to lay down for bed. By this time, both Tina and Bill were well prepared for their son. On Christmas morning they had received about every toy that a newborn baby could possibly want. Also, prior to Christmas, both Tina and Bill had stocked up on diapers and formula. Now, very soon, their son Michael would be the last addition to the happiest moment in Tina's and Bill's life. Just after 11:30, Tina had found herself being wheeled into a room, within the hospital, where she would wait on her son's arrival. As Tina then got comfortable, Bill made calls to Michigan to allow both of their families to know what was happening. Moments later Bill returned to his wife's side. "I love you, Bill," Tina said as their eyes met. "I love you too, honey," Bill answered as he picked up her hand and stared deeply into her eyes. Instantly, the two smiled at each other up until the moment was interrupted by another contraction. "Oh, Bill. This hurts so much," Tina managed as she fought to keep her smile. Then, as another contraction came over her, she had simultaneously stretched both arms around her belly as a male doctor walked into the room. "Hi, Dr. Viegel. How are you doing?" "I'm doing good, Tina. So this is how we get time off of work," the man joked. Then, as the doctor looked up to Bill, he continued. "And you must be William." "Yes, sir," Bill said as he reached out to shake the doctor's hand. The doctor was a short guy, at about 5 foot, and spoke with an accent that was hard for Bill to understand. "I'm just one of the doctors that works with your wife, Bill. The doctor that you're waiting on is Dr. Kennedy, and he'll be in soon. I just wanted to congratulate you two before I head home." "Thank you, Dr. Viegel," Tina said as she smiled at him. "I'll try to bring the baby back to the hospital within the next week so that you can see him." "Well, I'll be looking forward to that, Tina." Then, as the doctor looked back up to Bill, he continued, "Well, it's been nice to meet you, Bill, and once again, congratulations. I've gotta go how." With another handshake, the man then walked out of the room just as Tina began to have another contraction. It was just about 3 o'clock in the morning when the doctor had decided that it was time to move Tina to the delivery room. She had fully dilated, and so now, it was just gonna be a waiting game for Michael to enter the world when he was ready to. As to this point in Tina's pregnancy, Tina knew that her soon-to-be son was gonna grow up to be a little stubborn by the fact that he hadn't kicked, throughout the pregnancy, until the moment that Tina had, or was about to, fall asleep. In fact, Michael's kicking had even ended a moment of intimacy with her husband. So, by now, Tina was well prepared to be on her toes for the next 18 years. At about 3:15, Tina's contractions had increased a lot and only about 30 seconds apart from one another. Then, before Tina or Bill had a chance to even think in the terms of time, the room was soon filled with the sound of cries just as instant relief came over Tina's current level of pain. With the loud volume, from Michael, also came tears of joy down Bill's face as he assisted in cutting the umbilical cord. Moments later, just after Michael weighed in at 9 pounds and 6 ounces, he was laying on his mother's chest and headed back to sleep. Michael was born with good health, however, his lungs were slightly underdeveloped and so he was being kept under an ultraviolet light to help his lungs' development. Several years ago doctors had thought that this was a rare condition. As time went by, however, it was soon discovered that most babies were born with their lungs slightly underdeveloped. Michael would be no exception as he was placed into a clear plastic crib and wheeled into the nearby nursery. Once in the nursery, Michael was placed beside 3 other newborn infants, whom also, like Michael, each had a plastic white bracelet on their wrist that showed their names, their date and time of births, and their mother's names. Then, as Michael was placed beside the other infants and in front of a large window that overlooked into the hospital hallway, Bill gazed at his son for a couple more minutes before he decided to go back to his wife's side. At the same time that they had moved Michael to the nursery, they had also moved Tina out of the delivery room and back to the room that her and Bill had waited in earlier. Now, as Bill walked into the room, he found his wife to be asleep. Walking up to the side of the hospital bed, Bill leaned forward and kissed Tina lightly on the lips as he had also used his fingertips to comb a few strands of hair out of his wife's face. Then, moments later, he turned and walked back out of the room. Bill had decided that as a part of a gift to his wife, that he was gonna go back home and clean the house, top to bottom, so that there wouldn't be any housework for Tina to do at all. Since Tina was now asleep, this would be the perfect moment to do so. Though it was still about an hour and a half prior to sunrise, Bill had decided that he would wait until about 6 in the morning to head back to the hospital. He felt that this would be plenty of time to get the house spotless, call in to work to take the day off in the light of his son's birth, and then possibly take a short nap along the way. Just as planned, Bill woke at about 6 o'clock in the morning after just falling asleep. Or so it seemed, anyhow, that he had just fallen asleep. Sitting up off of the couch, Bill then quickly ran into the bathroom to brush his teeth, and then packed up an infant car seat and snowsuit into the car before heading up to the top of Finley Lane and then turning east on 9th. The weather, for that particular winter, had been extremely cold as winds blew very harshly out of the north. Already that winter Craig had seen record lows as winds had, more than once, closed many of the roads in and around Craig. In fact that winter, Bill had missed more than his share of work due to roads being closed between Craig and Hayden. Now, as Bill pushed through low drifts of snow, he hurried to be beside his wife again. The drive to the hospital, of which would normally only take about 5 minutes, had turned into 15 minutes as he finally turned into the hospital's parking lot. As he opened up his car door, he had simultaneously tucked the infant-sized snowsuit into the sleeve of his coat and then quickly darted towards the front entrance with his hands protecting his face from the brisk winds. As he finally approached the door, someone else, of whom must have been watching him cut across the parking lot, suddenly pushed the door open for Bill. "Thank you," Bill said, and then found himself looking into the eyes of an elderly woman, who just smiled back at him. "You're welcome, sir." The women responded, and then followed Bill back into the waiting area of the hospital, as Bill continued on down the hallway. Moments later, as Bill walked into his wife's room, she then turned to face him. "Hi honey," Tina said as a smile grew across her face. "Where did you go?" "Just back to the house for a while," Bill answered as he gazed back at his wife. "Quickly cleaned up a little and then took a quick cat nap." "How's Michael doing?" 0 hours, he's still asleep honey." "Are you hungry?" she asked as she also reached out towards him. "Yeah. I am. Do they have a cafeteria here?" "Bill," Tina said with a slight giggle in her voice, "every hospital has a cafeteria." Then, as she sat up on the edge of the mattress, she slid her feet into a pair of slippers that laid beside the hospital bed, and then also reached out to Bill for a hug. As they just held onto one another for about 3 minutes, Bill then helped Tina up to her feet as he also kept a tight hug onto her. "I'll show you the way. Then all you've got to do is pay," she said with a smile. For the most part, the day seemed to crawl by slowly for both Bill and Tina. For Michael, on the other hand, he kept waking up to the other 3 babies constantly crying. Then, periodically, someone would come into the room to open or close a curtain that was beside the large panel of glass that overlooked the hallway. At about 6 o'clock that afternoon, as Michael and his roommates all slept, Michael suddenly found someone that was too short to look over the top of the crib, reaching their hands into the temporary safe haven, and then taking a hold and lifting him over the edge of the crib. At first Michael was about to cry as he squirmed around in the person's arms. Then, as the person placed Michael over his shoulder, the feeling of the person's exhaled breath against his neck tickled Michael, causing him to suddenly kick and then smile. Simultaneously, Michael was then picked back up off of the person's shoulder as Michael then found himself staring into their face. "You know, I think that I like you," the short-statured person said. Wearing a black leather coat, black hair that was just as dark as the coat, and a darker color of skin than Michael's. The person then spoke again. "What's your name?" Momentarily looking at the plastic bracelet on Michael's right wrist, he then continued. "Well, Michael. Today is your lucky day." Then instantaneously the wooden door flew open as another person, an adult, walked in. "Who are you, young man?" "Ah. Michael's big brother," the smaller individual said. With a slight look of shock in his face, the younger person just stared at the man that wore blue scrubs. "Well, I'm sorry, but nobody belongs in here. You can look at your brother through the window." As the adult spoke, he then also lifted Michael out of the smaller person's arms as he then placed Michael back into the crib. Then, before turning back around to face the kid, the guy reopened the curtains that were supposed to be open at that time. Then headed to the door waving for the young man to follow him. Following the adult towards the door, he then left the room, right behind the older person, and then returned, on his own, just moments later. Closing the door behind himself, and then closing the curtain, as well, he then raced to Michael's left side, looked into the crib, where Michael just stared back, and saw Michael begin to smile again. Reaching into the crib again, the boy took a hold of Michael's left hand, carefully, and then pulled Michael's hand up to the edge of the crib. "Michael. I won't let this hurt too much," the kid whispered, and then suddenly Michael felt a slight sting to the back of his hand. Just moments later, the young guy placed Michael's hand, of which was now bleeding, back into the crib, and then seconds later, the sound of the wooden door could be heard again as the kid ran out of the room. Less than a minute later, two women walked into the room. "I wonder which one of you four pressed that button?" one of the two women asked. At about 6:30, just when both Bill and Tina were about to walk back to the cafeteria for dinner, Dr. Kennedy, with two police officers, walked into the room. "Hi Scott," Tina said immediately, and then paused as Officer Mark Ketz and Police Chief Chuck Kibbe followed in behind him. "What's going on?" "Tina. Something has. Mr. and Mrs. Hall." Officer Ketz interrupted the doctor. "About a half hour ago something happened to your son." "Is he all right?" Bill asked suddenly as he stood up, and then Tina simultaneously covered her face behind both of her hands. "Yes." Dr. Kennedy spoke up, "He's just fine. But he was cut, by someone, on the back of his hand." Officer Ketz interrupted Scott. "This cut was not accidental. It was done intentionally across the back of his left hand with a razor or a knife." "But," Tina spoke as she uncovered her face, "who would do that to a defenseless infant?" As Tina began to speak, both of her eyes watered up as Bill sat back down, beside his wife, on the mattress. "Ma'am. We don't know," Chief Kibbe said as he approached the side of Tina's bed. Chief Kibbe was very soft-spoken and was barely audible as opposed to the more aggressive officer beside him. "What we do know, however, is that whomever had done this, obviously didn't intend to do a lot of damage by the fact that it was only on the back of the hand." Pausing, as the chief now looked back to the doctor, Chuck then continued, "The doctor here says that the incision only needed a few stitches. 7 stitches to be exact, Tina." Pausing, as the doctor rubbed the side of his own head, "We're all thrown through a loop here, guys. Rather than waiting here in the hospital any longer, I'm gonna go ahead and sign your discharge papers right now." "How about Michael's lungs?" Tina asked. "What we'll do is make a few follow-up appointments to keep Mike under a ultraviolet light for a couple hours at a time. In fact, being that you work here, you could bring Michael in with you at the beginning of your shift and then take him with you after you clock out." As Dr. Kennedy finished his sentence, he looked back towards the officers. "Where do you folks live?" Officer Ketz asked. "On Finley Lane. Near the top of the hill on the east side," Bill answered. "Okay," Officer Ketz said, and then looked at Chief Kibbe. "Doesn't Officer Russell live up that way?" "Yeah, he does," Chuck answered, and then looked back at Bill. "What's your house number?" 887. Bill responded, and then looked back to Chuck. "All right. Just kitty corner from you guys, at 890 Finley Lane." "The Mexican family?" Tina interrupted. Yep, that's it. In the home is one of our police officers. Chief Kibbe said, his name is Officer Tom Russell. He's a good officer and a good man. I'll put you into contact with him after I let him know what's happening. You guys can let him know if anything or anyone suspicious is around your home. Also, I know that he'll look over the place for you as well. Alright. Thank you, Bill said and then took Tina's hand up in his own as he continued to watch the chief as he pulled a cell phone out of his pocket. About 7 months prior, as Elian was only 10 months old, Don D and Bobby John had learned that they had another kid on the way. At this, the baby was due on February 18th. Coincidentally, Lovisa and Macaulay were also expecting another child as well. With Lovisa and Macaulay, however, their child was due June 6 of 2045. With these two infants on the way with Micah and Elian already in the home, Tom and Lucifer now knew that they couldn't push off their plans to move out any longer. That's gonna be 4 babies crying while we're trying to sleep, Lucifer explained to Tommy. Not to mention all of the diaper changes, the need to be quiet, and… Lucifer. Tommy interrupted as he hugged him simultaneously. It's gonna be alright, just… In mid-sentence, Tommy was interrupted by the sound of his cell phone ringing. It's my chief, Tom said with an odd look on his face. Hello. Hey Officer Russell, how are you doing this afternoon? Chuck asked quietly. Almost as if he was calling him early for work. I'm doing alright. Tom replied. What's up? Well, I'm at the hospital with a woman who just had a child. Just a little while ago, while the infant was in the nursery room, someone walked into the room and cut the backside of the baby's hand. Someone used a knife on a newborn baby. Tom interrupted. Yes. And we don't know who did it. Pausing a moment, Chuck then continued, this lady lives kitty corner from you guys at 887 Finley Lane. I need you to please monitor her home for anything odd for me, Tom. The parents are kinda shook up right now, but the baby is alright? What's the family's name? Tom asked as he quickly pulled a card out of his wallet and motioned for Lucifer to find him a pen. The parents are Tina and Bill Hall. Pausing, Chuck allowed enough time for Tommy to write down the information, and then the child is named Michael Dale Hall. He was born today. On the back of his own business card, Tommy then wrote December 28th after Michael's name with DOB just afterwards. As he wrote down the information, Lucifer looked over his shoulder as Tommy had also turned the card towards Lucifer to show him. Beyond what he was hearing, what stood out to Lucifer was the address of 887 Finley Lane. Just under 2 months later, on February 17th of 2045, Don D and Bobby John found themselves, back in the hospital, waiting on their new son, Jeffrey, to be born. Meantime, back at home, both Tommy and Lucifer were packing their belongings and moving out to Ridgeview. With the quickly growing family, changes had to be made and they had to be made now. As pre-planned, prior to Bobby John and Don D going to the hospital, Macaulay and Lovisa would move down to Angel's and Eddie's bedroom. Eddie and Angel would move up to the master bedroom. Micah, along with his soon-to-be brother, Malcolm, would move into Tom's and Lucifer's old bedroom, downstairs. Elian, and his soon-to-be brother, Jeffrey, would stay in Elian's current room, across from the master bedroom upstairs, while their parents would remain in their room upstairs. All of these changes were to take place before Don D and Bobby John arrived back at home with their new son. I can't believe how fast things are changing around here, James said as him and Lloyd both watched as Eddie and Angel reassembled Micah's crib in Tom's and Lucifer's old bedroom. It's like a baby boom. Lloyd finished for James. Lloyd and James had both decided that they were gonna oversee the assembly of Micah's and Malcolm's bedroom while Sterling and Scott watched over the overhaul of Elian's and Jeffrey's bedroom. Though Malcolm nor Jeffrey had even been born yet, it had now looked as if there were 4 infants living within the home. 4 babies between July of 2043 and June of this year. It's a baby boom alright. Lloyd continued as he kneeled and looked at the box that contained the new crib for Jeffrey. The box showed a picture of an infant standing within the crib with its arms raised to be lifted by an adult. The box itself probably weighed twice as much as what Lloyd had before he died, This also means that in about 5 years or so that we will be seeing the kids off to school again. And back to a non-nocturnal sleep schedule during the school season. James added. Then, as James went and stood beside his 7-year-old friend, he continued. This is gonna be so cool, man. Then, as James looked at Micah, as Angel attempted to hold the infant and hold up one side of Micah's crib at the same time, Micah's attention was suddenly on Lloyd as he simultaneously pointed. "Nah nah 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 nah." Micah suddenly screeched, causing Angel to flinch. With the baby chatter, drool began to run down the 11-month-old's bottom lip. Among the drool, a single bubble grew and then burst, causing a mist within the sunbeam that shined through the window. "Hi Micah," Lloyd said from his kneeling position as he turned his head towards the loud babbling. "How are you doing?" Upstairs, in Elian's and soon-to-be Jeffrey's room, Macaulay and his father, whom came over to help with the moving, were almost complete with the transformation of Elian's and Jeffrey's room. As Macaulay kneeled beside his son, he watched as Ronnie held up one side of a rail guard to the crib, as Sterling held up the other end. To someone that didn't know that there was a ghost holding up one side of the frame, it would seem that Macaulay's father was performing one hell of a trick. "Hey Scott." Sterling spoke up as he attempted to line up holes between the part that he was holding and the end piece. "Would you please hand me that bolt and washer beside your foot?" Looking down beside himself, Scott found a single bolt and a single washer that was separated from the others due to difference in size. Leaning forward, Scott then grasped the two metal objects between his fingers and then walked over to Sterling. "These ones?" "Yep." "Thank you," Sterling said as he then took the parts and assembled the two parts of the crib. Elian's and Jeffrey's room was planned to be different than that of Micah's and Malcolm's room. The biggest difference being that Micah and Malcolm would each have a crib while Elian would have a small twin-sized bed instead. Jeffrey, on the other hand, would have a crib. Now, as Jeffrey's crib was almost complete, the hardest part of the day's planned events was about done. "Hey Macaulay," Ron said as he turned to face his son, "how about you help Sterling hold that rail up while he puts in the rest of the bolts?" "All right Dad," Macaulay replied and then left his son with Scott. In about another 2 hours, both of the infant bedrooms were complete as midnight neared. "Hey guys," Eddie spoke up as him and Angel both walked into the upstairs room. "I'm gonna go ahead and make lunch. And, it looks like that we're all done now," Ed continued. "How's grilled cheese sandwiches sound?" "Sounds good to me," Ron responded, "and then I'll head home and make lunch for Belinda." With the end of his sentence, Ron lightly put his arm over his son's shoulder as they followed behind Elian, who fought to balance himself while he also kept a bottle clenched between his teeth. In Elian's efforts, milk ran down the length of his left canine and then down his chin. Simultaneously, Elian also held his diaper up with his right hand as it seemed to threaten to fall mid-step. Then suddenly, without warning, the household's 4 dogs, of which was soon to be only 2, suddenly raced out of the kitchen, into the hallway and into Elian, causing him to instantly fall onto the hallway floor. With this, Elian's bottle flew the opposite direction as it bounced off of the wall and down the stairs leading to the front door of the house. Manouk, Kiana, Barrow, and Kotzebue. "Stop," Eddie shouted loudly. Then, before Elian even had a chance to cry, Macaulay had lifted him up off of the floor and was holding on to him tightly as Eddie continued to restrain the dogs. Years ago, when Spud was the only pet in the house, there wasn't much of an obedience problem within the home. Over time, however, as Angel gained Manouk, Tommy gained Kotzebue, Lucifer Barrow, and then Macaulay Kiana, oftentimes moments were interrupted by tail chasing, sock pulling, and then, now, child railroading. "When is Lucifer and Tom picking up their dogs?" Macaulay asked as he stood up with his son in his arms. "They said that they would come back after lunch," Angel responded. "They wanted to get their apartment arranged first." "Well, good," Macaulay said as he patted Elian on the back. "This is getting to be a real pain in the butt." Though both Tommy and Lucifer were now 25 years old, till this moment they always had the security of their home on Finley Lane. Those securities had already been interrupted once when Lucifer's parents, Malachi and Nicole, had moved out of the home. Now, although they lived within 100 yards of Lucifer's parents, They had lost the childhood security of home. "Well, we've done it, Tommy. Here's a home of our own." The silence within the apartment, especially at 1 o'clock in the morning, was eerie to both of the boys. It was almost too quiet as they could hear each other's breath. Without quite stepping all of the way into the only light on within the apartment, Lucifer carefully hugged Tommy from behind as he then gently kissed Tom on the side of the neck. "A home that is kinda scary," Tommy responded as he had also reached his hands behind himself, and then pulled Lucifer tighter to his backside, allowing his warmth to fulfill that void. "But I'm almost betting that it'll be different once we have Barrow and Kotzebue over here." "Well, how about we go get them right now then," Lucifer said as he turned Tommy within his arms. In the process of doing so, Tommy's off-duty service weapon snagged on Lucifer's belt loop. Soon, however, as they faced each other, they hugged once again and then let go as they headed to the door. "Then everything will be as close to normal as we are gonna get." Malachi and Nicole were happy that their son and son-in-law made the move out to Ridgeview. The two of them looked forward to daily visits from the two as opposed to the weekly ones during family days that were routine now for many years. These family days contained either small trips away, as a family unit, or a night filled with games and movies. Lucifer's grandmother, Karina, and great-grandmother, Marie, also looked forward to the changes included in having Tommy and Lucifer nearby. Lucifer's uncle and aunt, Ronnie and Belinda, were also proud of their nephew's choice. "Here they are, guys," Ron announced just as they were finishing their lunch. With his announcement, the kitchen sliding glass door then opened as Tommy and Lucifer stepped in. "Just came back to grab the dogs and see that everything was getting done," Tommy announced. Since the short period of time that they had been in the house, both of the boys had seemed to have been freezing as Tommy had both of his hands hidden within his armpits and Lucifer couldn't seem to get his hands deep enough into his pockets. "Well," Ron responded, "here are some leftover grilled cheese sandwiches. How about you two warm up real quick," Ron said as Angel then poured Tommy and Lucifer coffee. "Also, you two might want to consider driving rather than flying in the dead of winter." "But Uncle Ronnie," Lucifer spoke up, "it would take a much shorter amount of time to fly than what it would to just warm up a car." "And," Tom added, "we don't have a car." "Your dad does. Your grandma Karina does, and so does your grandma Marie. You can see that I drove over here," Ron said. "Don't be afraid to ask. We're your family. That's what we're here for." Wrapping his arm around his nephew's shoulder and squeezing him, Ron then continued in a much quieter volume. "Also Lucifer, just because we're vampires doesn't mean that we can't freeze. You two need to be wearing your coats when it's 10 below zero outside." With his words, Ron also pulled at the t-shirt that his nephew was wearing. It was a little after noon when half of the family had found themselves at the hospital on February 18th. As everyone, except Bobby John, waited in the waiting room, everyone looked forward to the birth of Bobby John's and Dondi's second child. Ronnie had become tired of just sitting around waiting for his third grandchild. Soon, Ronnie had found himself pacing the halls of the hospital, as he anticipated the moment of joy that was soon to come. As time went on, Ron had found himself down a hallway that was full of offices on both sides. Near one of the offices, he had found himself staring at a plaque that showed the names of former administrators. Only taking a glance at the plaque, he found that it dated as far back as the 1970s. Focusing on two of the brass name tags, within the mid-1980s period of time, two names seemed to stick out to him. Frank and Barrand. Without any obvious reason, these two names seemed to have echoed within his memory. "Hey Dad." Turning to the familiar voice, Ronnie found himself facing Bobby John. "Hey buddy. What's up? It's almost time. And Dondi would like you to be in the room with us," Bobby John said as he placed a hand on his father-in-law's shoulder. "Are you alright, Dad?" "Well yeah," Ron answered as he turned to look into Bobby John's face. "Why do you ask?" "It's just that." Pausing, as he looked down to the floor, as they headed towards the delivery room, "You looked lost, that's all." "Thanks for your concern, Bobby John," Ron said and then abruptly stopped mid-step as he simultaneously looked back to Bobby. "How did you know where to find me?" "Well," Pausing, as Bobby John encouraged his father-in-law to keep walking, "You know my abilities with telekinesis." "Yeah. Well, I also know how to use remote viewing, of which allows me to see things from the perspective of someone else. I saw you headed down a hallway full of offices including administration. Then I saw you looking at the hospital administrator history plaque." Looking back to Ron, Bobby John continued. "It's like how us vampires use ESP to communicate between each other, but only I can see images rather than just hearing someone's thoughts. Since I too am a vampire, however, I have the combination of the two abilities." "That's a pretty powerful ability, Bobby John," Ron responded as they were then standing in front of the delivery room. And the United States government thinks so as well. Back in the era of the Vietnam War, there was a group of people formed, and placed in the White House, that was called Stargate. These people, or Stargate, were formed to search for POWs and MIAs. "That's cool, Bobby John," Ron said as he and Bobby both put on blue scrubs. "Sometime we'll have to talk more about it." As 6:30 rolled around that afternoon, Dawn Dee had found herself wondering if her husband and father would return soon enough for her new son, Jeffrey, to come into the world. Then, just as soon as the thought had crossed her mind, the delivery room door opened as Ronnie and Bobby John walked in. "It's about time, guys," Dawn Dee said as she tried to smile. "I told you that I would be back with your dad soon," Bobby John said as he approached his wife's side. Moments later, Ron was standing beside his daughter as well, across from Bobby John. "I love you, honey," Ron said as he picked up his daughter's hand. Then, all at once, a contraction began that caused Dawn Dee to nearly sit up, as the nurse instantaneously jumped to catch Jeffrey as he shot out of his mother. "Oh, help me, Dad," Dawn Dee yelled. Then, just seconds later, heard Jeffrey begin to cry loudly, filling the room with deafening screams. "It's all right, honey," Bobby John ensured as he quickly volunteered himself to be the one to cut the umbilical cord. Moments later the newborn was quickly washed off, wrapped in a blanket, and then returned to Dawn Dee, where both Ronnie and Bobby John just stared in awe. "Hello, Jeffrey," Hetty Southern. "I'm your father." And I'm your grandfather," Ron said as he then used his index finger to rub the back of the baby's hand. All that Dawn Dee could do is stare at her son as she listened to her husband and father introduce themselves. As she looked into Jeffrey's eyes, she watched as Jeffrey seemed to just look at everything around himself, rather than at any particular object. Over time, since Elion was born, Dawn Dee had learned that newborns have double vision that makes their ability to see almost impossible. "Hey, Dad." Dawn Dee broke a moment of silence. "Would you please go and get Mom?" "Yes, I will," Ron said quietly with a smile on his face. "I'll be right back." Then, with that said, Ronnie quickly slipped out the door. As the door shut behind him, Bobby John leaned forward and kissed his wife, and then his newborn son, on the head. It had seemed as though Ron had just left the room when he then returned with Belinda holding Elion. Waiting outside of the delivery room, however, they knew to follow Dawn Dee while she would be carefully moved into a room that would be adequate for the family to visit. Soon enough, however, Elion was soon looking at his baby brother. "Brother," the 19-month-old said in a high-pitched voice as he pointed at my briquet. "Yep," Belinda said to her grandson, "that's your baby brother." As Elion listened to his grandmother, slobber ran out of his mouth as he then smiled and then began to struggle to get out of Belinda's arms. "Come here, Elion," Bobby John said just as his oldest son's feet hit the floor. Then, as he leaned forward to pick his son up, he then whispered into Elion's ear, "Do you wanna lay down with your mommy and little brother?" Instantly, without a verbal response, Elion then stretched his arms mid-air towards his mom as Dawn Dee simultaneously smiled back. Then, just as Elion was beside his mom, he climbed partially onto her belly to observe Jeffrey as he nursed. "That's the new baby?" Elion asked in a squeaky voice. "Yep. But you need to be quiet while he is asleep," Dawn Dee responded as she gently pulled Elion's little body closer to Jeffrey. Compared to the rest of the vampire family, Elion had unusually large canines that reached nearly an inch below his bottom lip. From the standpoint of a stranger, What was normally drawing attention to members within the family was just a meager difference when compared to the teeth of Elion's. When facing Elion, you can see an unusual growth to the maxilla and zygoma bone area of his face as well. With close inspection of the individual canines, however, you can see that the two teeth were perfect. No chips out of the enamel and no denting showing below the level of the crowns. Overall, Elion was a handsome-looking tyke. Those differences, however, made him appear to be almost a spitting image of his late great-great-great-great-grandfather, Miguel Sanchez. For normal routine medical and dental purposes, Bobby John and Don D stayed just another night while Elion went with his grandparents out to Ridgeview. Through the exams, Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Lynch both agreed that their newest child would turn out just the same as the rest of the males in the family. And, as the family knew, another vampire that would prosper as a creature of the night, give protection towards his mother as predestined for many centuries before him. "Okay honey," Bobby John joked back with his wife as she spoke of the family heritages, "your grandmother spelled it all out for me many years ago. Not to mention, that this is our second child." Inching his way closer to Don D, as he sat on a padded chair that was in the hospital room, it was as if he was daring himself to climb right up onto the bed with her and start working on their third child. About an hour prior to this moment, a nurse, that Bobby John and Don D both knew from across the street from their own home, had come and moved Jeffrey to the nursery. "Tina really is a sweet lady," Don D said as her thoughts went from her joking with her husband, to memories of knowing that Tina's son, Michael, was hurt in that same nursery when he was born just 2 months earlier. "It's just too bad that someone would harm an innocent child like that." "I know," Bobby John agreed as he quickly calmed down from the humorous moment prior to this, "but nothing will ever happen to our children. And, if anything were to happen, they can defend themselves better than most children can." With this said, Bobby John then stood up from the chair, then went to his wife's side. Halfway sitting on the bed, he took Don D's hand up into his own as he gently kissed the back of her hand. In doing so, Bobby, ever so lightly, pricked her skin with a canine and then quickly licked off the little bit of blood that rose to the surface. For the majority of the remaining night, Don D and Bobby John spent the hours, prior to going to bed at a non-nocturnal schedule, watching television. It was a different television than what they had been used to at home, nothing less. However, the boredom in the hospital finally took over, causing Bobby John to decide to move over to the other bed and doze off. For Don D, however, sleep wasn't so easy as she worried about her son in a potentially dangerous environment. Before too much longer though, just the same as her husband, boredom took control of her ability to fight drowsiness as well. Then, turning over onto her side, she stared into the direction of her husband, and gazed at him until soon, she too was asleep.